Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the IceCream4PRs podcast. My name is Jeff Nippard, and with me, as always, is my co-host, Robin.
Hello.
And today we have a very special guest with us. He is Cliff Wilson of Team Wilson Natural Bodybuilding. Welcome to the show, Cliff.
Hey, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, it's our pleasure. So if any of you guys don't know who Cliff is, he's someone who I really look up to as a natural bodybuilding prep coach, and his accolades within the industry really speak for themselves when it comes to the actual athletes that he's coached and the level of muscular development and conditioning that they bring to the stage. So Cliff, why don't you just tell us a little bit about your personal training background and then also a little bit about your coaching background?
Yeah, I've been training for about 12 years now. It's hard to believe it's been that long. Started just after high school, my first year of college. Just got into it as a hobby after I finished playing basketball in college after my first year. And right when I picked up a weight, you know how it is, it's addicting. And I knew instantly I wanted to compete. And so, that kind of became my goal, is to just step on stage. And I'm not naturally a very muscular guy, so it kind of became my goal to really get on stage and do it right. So, I didn't want to, a lot of guys when they go about it, they go about reading, like a lot of the muscle magazines and stuff like that, but, that's usually not filled with great information. So I kind of tried to go the more, I would say, scientific route with my own approach to training, and try to just basically get my hands on anything I could read about physiology, nutrition, and training, and then just apply it to my own. And I did my first show in 2008. I did pretty well. I took second place. I was easily the smallest guy on stage, but I was the leanest. And then just after that, I had a few people start asking me if they could help them get ready for if I could help them get ready for shows. I didn't really think of it as, I didn't even know prep coaching was really a profession. Let me put it that way. I didn't know prep coaching was really a profession. I was kind of, I wasn't very much on the internet around that time. My wife always makes fun of me for being completely computer illiterate around that time. And so
when was this, Skip?
This was 2008.
Okay, gotcha.
And so, I just started helping a few people in my gym for free because they definitely didn't know what they were doing. And so, actually I put my first client on stage. They weren't paying me or anything, and he ended up winning his first show, and it kind of snowballed from there. When one client did well, it went to the next, and in actually 5 out of the first 6 shows that I put people in, they ended up winning the overall. So my business took off pretty quickly after that, around 2011.
Right. Did you start off with clean eating preps back then?
I did. I started off with, I wouldn't say fully clean eating like that, but I would say I was more or less like a little...
meal plans.
Yeah, I was, and especially a little more restrictive with my food choices than I am now. And, you grow and you learn.
So Jeff's first client, he did a clean eating prep with him.
Oh yeah, I just drove him into the dirt with chicken and broccoli. That's it. Came in shredded.
Yeah, it was sweet potatoes and all that good stuff.
Yeah.
And it was you evolve over time, and I think every coach, they learn their mistakes. At least they should. Let me put it that way.
Yeah.
And so around 2011, I started doing this full time after only started coaching for about a year and a half. I started doing it full time, and I've been lucky to work with some really great athletes since then. I've helped some people turn pro, and been fortunate enough to work with a few world champions as well, and it's been pretty crazy, to be honest with you.
So let's just talk about a couple of these athletes. Like, I know you did at least part of the prep for Doug Miller's latest contest season. Is that right?
Yes, yeah. I helped Doug probably the last 10 weeks, 6 weeks out from the Gaspari when he won, and then I helped him from the Gaspari to the Yorton Cup when he won that, and then from the Yorton to the Jay Cutler Classic when he took the overall there as well.
Oh, wow.
That's awesome.
In the past, I've also worked with Candace Scott. She's the 2013 Yorton World Champ, and the 2014 DFAC World Champ.
Oh, there. I wonder if she was on the board of judges at the show that I just did in New York, because I know it was a Yorton Cup winner. Was she bikini or figure?
She was bodybuilding, women's bodybuilding.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
this is a bikini competitor, and there was one figure competitor.
Oh, yeah. Candace, if anybody out there Googles her name, Candace Scott, she, even as a male, well, first off, I gotta say, she's one that shows that you can be very muscular and still be feminine, but her pecs and her shoulders put me to shame so poorly. Yeah. I actually worked with a short stint through an off-season period with John Hansen. I think a lot of people know him as well. And then I've also worked with Ashley Leahy. She's an Optimum sponsored athlete, and she was the NGA World Bikini Champion as well.
Oh, wow.
So you work with all sorts of physique oriented athletes, so bikini, figure, men's physique, bodybuilding, just everything.
Yes, yeah. I would say I tend to get a little bit more, I would say, pigeonholed into, a lot of people think of me as just more of a bodybuilding coach, but yeah, I have quite a few of all of them.
That's interesting. Yeah, we're just looking up photos here of Candace Scott on Google, and yeah, she looks unbelievable, man. Nice work.
Yeah, we're aiming for a little bit leaner this year with her, but you know, her muscle bellies are incredibly
crazy.
Yeah, and her waist is tiny. So.
Wow.
Oh my gosh, she has bigger delts than I do. That's crazy.
That's insane.
Wow. Yeah, so I was just gonna say I think that is one of the better attributes of good coaches, is the willingness to change your approach over time and evolve as a coach, because you see some of these prep gurus online and they're just pushing the same stuff that they've been pushing.
To their original views that they'll just
they just get set in one way of doing things, and then they just stick to it no matter what evidence shows up to the contrary, you know.
Oh yeah, and people that when they're asked questions about why they use a certain method, that get defensive.
Oh man,
I'm always curious why they've developed such an emotional attachment to their ideas.
Dude, I know, like, yeah, I mean, well, I'm probably guilty of it a little bit. Like when I first discovered about flexible dieting and if it fits your macros from Lane, I was kind of like, you'd have to be crazy to do clean eating. Like, this doesn't make any sense. And like, I was kind of vehement about it and everything. But now I just have completely come around and mellowed out. And it's just like, whatever you choose to do is what you choose to do. Like, we're talking about bodybuilding, nutrition, and training here. Like, it's not
like if a bland diet is going to help you like be adherent, and like as long as you're getting enough nutrients from your diet, then I don't see it as like the hugest issue. Because some people find with too much food variety that like one little serving of cereal like can just put them over the edge for like cravings. Like then they just want more and more and more, and then have a hard time eating whole foods.
Oh, I totally agree. You know, some people, they almost need that clean eating to keep them on track. And you know, I have a bad habit where I know a lot of people really get caught up in big debates with people on the internet, and I almost never do that, just because I'm like, you know what, if some guy wants to so if somebody if somebody's really adamant that they want to drop their water and their sodium before a stage, and they have all the facts in front of them, and I'm not going to keep arguing with them.
Yeah.
Exactly. I've learned to stay away from that too, because, you know, at the end of the day, I'm not sure how much gets accomplished from that sort of confrontational approach online. I think a lot of people learn a lot more just from these sorts of conversations where people are just open-minded. You just kind of share your thoughts, share your opinions, and then, you know, if you differ, then that's cool, and we all can, you know, just uniquely share what it is that we believe without judgment.
Oh, yeah. And guess I should state that I didn't necessarily always use that approach. I used to argue with people on the internet.
Dude, me too. I used to go out and find it. Like, I would find statuses that I didn't like.
My wife would get on me, and she's like, "Why are you getting so worked up?" I'm like, "'Cause he's wrong."
You just get so passionate about it.
Yeah. And for the people who do that, I mean, it is a source of entertainment for the rest of us who just lurk, right? So it's not all bad.
And I feel like when you're one of the early adopters of IFYM, you had like a duty to like enforce it or something.
Yeah.
And then now that it's like years later, we're like the people who adopted it really early are just like, Yeah, we'll just let the newbies like argue for it.
And you know what? I don't know if you've noticed this, Cliff. I don't actually even know where you stand with like if it fits your macros and flexible dieting and clean eating and all that stuff. But I've noticed like some people have sort of reacted to it now adversely in the other direction. So it's like people who were once like extreme IIFYMers posting like their froyo bowls and stuff like that are now just like, you know, you should try to eat clean, or like it should mostly be clean, and like if it's almost like if it fits your macros has now kind of started to like take a little bit of a backseat. Like it's not as hot and fresh and cool anymore, if that makes sense. Just like a little trend I've noticed on social media or whatever. But do you actually do you think that there's any difference between, let's say, clean foods and then dirty foods on a contest prep? Like some contest prep coaches that I know personally will limit the junk food, say at like 3 weeks out or a month out or something, and they're convinced that this really makes a difference in terms of the hardness and level of conditioning that they can bring. Is this something that you enforce on people, or do you take more of an approach where as long as it hits your macros even up until peak week or even during peak week, which we'll talk about in a minute, it doesn't really matter, it does come down to the macros at the end of the day?
You know, I really think it comes down to the macros at the end of the day. The way I always describe it to my clients is, you know, I encourage them to get more fruits and vegetables in their diet, because I do think that if they go for too long without, you know, consuming any nutrient-dense foods, and when I say nutrient, I mean, you know, not macronutrients, but micronutrients and, you know, different phytochemicals, then obviously it'll get to a point where their body is not necessarily healthy, which I don't think an unhealthy body would put muscle growth at very high of a priority. But, you know, in the short term, I don't think it's really going to make much of a difference. And usually I think for health, I always tell my clients, it's up to them how healthy they want to be. They're grown adults and they can make that decision. But when it comes to fat loss, I just don't think it's going to make really any noticeable difference. Perfect example, one time I had a client go through his entire competition prep, and on show day he looked amazing, completely shredded, turned pro that day, and at the end of his show day he goes, and to think I did this but with eating nothing but Cocoa Puffs and chicken breasts for 6 days. And I go, well, what do you mean, like nothing but? And it turns out his carbs were pretty high. He never dropped below 220 carbs per day, and he literally got every single bit of his carbohydrates from Cocoa Puffs for about the last 12 weeks.
That's crazy.
Oh, wow. Yeah. See, that's what I mean about people. Like, I'm like that. Like, on my last prep, it was, like, chicken and, like, some greens, and then literally the rest of my carbs would be ice cream. Like, I could not stop myself from eating, like, 5 cups of ice cream a day.
Like, when we traveled to the States to compete, we would buy a full tub of Dryer's ice cream, because you can't get that here in Canada. We would eat one serving and then throw it down the toilet. Because it was like, I'll just keep eating it, and then we'd go out and buy another full tub just for one serving. But yeah.
But yeah, I totally believe that about that bodybuilder client of yours. Like, I don't know, when you like something on prep and you have that flexibility with your macros, it's kind of difficult not to do that, especially when you feel like you know better. You're like, oh, well, at the end of the day, it's the macronutrients that matter, so you just like can't not do it. Like, I just can totally relate to that.
Yeah, and if you find that food, and I don't know about you guys, but I get stuck on foods even personally, and you know, if I find it and that's what I'm enjoying at the time, I'll just keep with it because it helps me stay on track as well. You know, you just keep going with it.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, I actually have a couple questions for you, Cliff, about one of your athletes in particular, and if this crosses the line of you know, confidentiality, you just let me know. But Robin and I were talking a couple days ago about who our celebrity crushes are. And like, I was like, I don't really have one, but like, not really a crush, but like your idol, let's say. And like, I was like, I don't know, like I really was a huge fan of Radiohead growing up. So like Tom York was like an idol for me. Like, he's someone that I would probably like faint if I met in person, you know? And she was like, I was like, who would it be for you? And she's like, I don't really have anyone. And she's like, actually, you know what? It's Doug Miller, like 100%. And it's true, man. Like, I thought I was going to lose my girl when I was at the Arnold, and like I saw Doug walk by. Like, so What sort of macros does he diet on? Like, he's a huge guy, right? Like, he carries a ton of muscle. Is he one of those luxury macros types of dudes who gets really shredded on like 300 plus carbs, or does he have to grind, or like what's his deal?
Doug, well, I guess I should first stipulate that, Doug, when I helped him finish out last year, it was, I've known Doug for a few years. He sponsored me since 2012. So, helped him finish out those last several weeks last year for, I think it was a total of 10 to 12 weeks. I would say more in friend capacity. But, I did, we make the final adjustments on all of those. So, with Doug, I will say when he first asked me, because I've been a fan of bodybuilding, like I said, for quite natural bodybuilding for such a long time. And Doug won his first Yorton Cup in 2009, I believe, a year after I got into the sport, really. And I've always looked up to him as a competitor. So when he asked me to bring him home into the shows last year, me as a fan of bodybuilding, I was like, holy crap, that's
Yeah, I would faint.
Oh, my wife, on a side note, when Doug texted me and said, "Hey, will you help me, finish this out?" My wife, I showed the text to my wife. You know what she says to me is, "Just don't mess it up." Thanks.
Good advice.
Yeah, I would. Yeah,
but he doesn't. Doug doesn't have an extraordinary metabolism, given how big he is.
I think I watched that interview with you, and you said that. I'm having a flashback to that.
Yeah, to get him fully lean, we had to dig fairly hard. Doug's a high protein guy. Like when we started with him, I think when I started with him, he was taking in 310 grams on his prep, and I reduced it over time to about 280, and we got that down. I think his carbs got down to a low of about 120, but we got him down low. Fats were around the 55 gram range. I'm doing the sum of off my head, so these are ballpark figures. Yeah. But we had him ready early before the Gaspari, and so we were able to bring food up for a couple of weeks before peak week, and we got his carbohydrates back up to about 200 before peak week, and then actually before the Yorton, we got the carbs actually up to about 275 per day. So he was able to maintain his weight on pretty high macros, but to get him down, we had to dig pretty hard.
Right.
Okay. And what do you think about high protein diets like that? Are you like on the 1 gram per pound kind of camp, or generally with your regular clients, or what do you think about that?
I'm actually a little controversial, I guess I would say, in that department. I do the opposite. A lot of people, I would say a lot of people in the more scientific minded coaches, they tend to do somewhere around 1 gram per pound of body weight, and then they'll bring it up a little bit once the contest prep starts. I actually do the opposite. I go very high in the off season with protein intake, and because my view is that this is when caloric intake is high, energy levels are sufficient to fuel hard training. And if I take an extra 30 or 40 grams from carbohydrates and give it to protein, it won't be at the detriment to performance, because there should be plenty of energy and glucose to go around to fuel hard training. And I'm not sure if many out there have ever read John Bossy's papers on protein spread and change theories, but he showed that the optimal protein intake, or the protein intake that will usually give the highest degree of results in terms of muscle growth, will be the one that has a change upon baseline of protein intake. Yeah. So I sort of use protein intake as a way to create a higher protein intake change from baseline. And then what I do is during prep, I will bring protein down to a more moderate level to spare carbohydrates, so I can use that for training. So I kind of do it a little bit backwards from what most people do.
That's cool. The change theory is, did you say Boss? Because I heard John Boss talk about his research on this, or was it someone else?
Yes. Yep.
Okay, Boss. Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I am familiar with that. That's interesting. That's the first time I've ever heard anyone actually apply that research. So that's really interesting, because a lot of people just go by either the Eric Helms paper or the 0.82 paper on the marathon runners or whatever. So that's actually really cool. I've actually never heard of that approach, and it's unorthodox, but it sounds interesting. And just one other quick question about your clients. what, I know, like, guys, Cliff has worked with so many athletes and so many elite athletes that while you guys know that I'm a science-based practitioner, I love reading and interpreting research, but when it comes to bodybuilding contest prep, I value the opinion of someone who's worked with a lot of people, specifically who are contest prep bodybuilders
and natural athletes,
because a lot of this research is done on just general population, or like, you know, average day gym goer type dudes, and not necessarily bodybuilders in contest prep. Our research there really is limited to just like a handful of case studies and then extrapolations from, you know, non-contest prep populations. So Cliff's opinion here really is highly valued. I'm wondering if you've noticed a trend whether bigger, more muscular guys tend to be able to get away with more carbs, or if, you know, smaller, say more active, like just hyper type dudes are able to get away with more carbs. And what is the most carbs you've ever dieted a guy on for a competition and got lean?
I do tend to find that the bigger guys typically are typically not the biggest carb monsters. You know, I know you've done some prep as well, Jeff. I don't know if you noticed that, but it seems like a lot of the smaller, leaner guys, and like you said, the very hyper ones as well. Yeah. They tend to be the bigger carb monsters, and every once in a while you'll get somebody that's sort of in between. You know, not necessarily the biggest of the big muscular freaks, but somewhere middle of the road, but also very hyperactive, and so they'll be the I would say the ones that are going to take the most. Trying to think, I do have one client that is very big and also a pretty hyper guy, and the lowest his carbohydrates ever got during his prep was 325 grams. He weighed about 159 pounds on show day.
Oh my God.
And yeah, and his carb load, and you know, I know we're going to talk a little bit about peak week, but his carb load for his body weight was insane. He weighed 159 pounds before his load, and we ended up using I want to say close to 1,300 grams the day before. And so
that's not 1,300 like you know, that's 2 days of intake for some bikini girls that I know in calories. Like that's 1,300 grams of carbohydrates.
Yeah, so multiply that by 4.
Crazy.
Yeah, I really became concerned. My biggest concern with him wasn't spill. It was, is his digestive tract going to keep up?
Yeah,
I'd be worried about bloating. Like, did you give him specific guidelines for what type of carbs to consume, like low residue carbs, or?
Yes, yeah. When I do, you know, the rapid backload peak, I do give specific foods that I want people to handle because of digestive purposes, and as well as keeping balance on a few things as I go through. So yeah, that was definitely in his plan.
So let's just jump right into the peak week stuff. I know a lot of guys and girls are going to be curious about your approach here. So let's just take these one by one. First, what is your general approach? So just to make sure everybody knows, peak week is from, I'm going to call it Saturday to Saturday. So if the show is on Saturday, it's 1 week out from the competition. And this is when you hear all of that talk on the internet where there's all this voodoo magic and you're going to drop your water and you're going to fill out and all this sort of stuff. And everyone changes everything come peak week so that they can look the best for show day. I'm curious to know what it is your approach is here, Cliff. So for carbohydrates, what do you normally do for peak week?
Well, you know, I guess I would say the style of peak I use will be a little bit dependent on the category. First off, if I'm peaking a bikini competitor or a figure competitor, I will either use a front load or what I call is almost a physique management load, where, you know, the front load is obviously where you bring carbohydrates up at the beginning of the week, and then you'll maybe taper down a little bit as the week continues with maybe a slight loading on Friday before the person hits the stage, and then again on Saturday. What I call like a physique management or a subtle backload is where essentially I'll bring carbohydrates up very slowly and gradually across the week. It's more to bring out a subtle look and to find the look that I like for that figure or bikini athlete. And then once I find that look that I really like, you know, not too full and not too flat, I just stick with that and I try to maintain that going into the show. Now with bodybuilders, and I should say I'll use this method. I use a rapid backload. That's kind of the term I just started calling it. I use a rapid backload, and I'll also use this for figure competitors where they are doing a show where a more extreme look is favored. So maybe my figure competitors that are doing the World Championships, because usually at the World Championships, more extreme looks are rewarded. Very lean, very full looks for figure are rewarded at those higher levels. So I'll also use a backload in those instances as well. But the rapid backload is something that I started using in 2011, and a lot of people were really not too. They were pretty skeptical about what I was doing. Where essentially I will deplete carbs for 3 or 4 days, Monday through Thursday or Tuesday through Thursday, and then on Friday I will bring carbs up very high. Most male competitors will probably be in the range of 900 to 1400 grams of carbs on Friday, and most female competitors in the range of 500 to about 1,000.
So much, wow.
Grams, yeah, on the day before the show. So then. Those are my usual methods there for bodybuilders, and the bodybuilding one, obviously that's a pretty extreme approach, but I've had really good luck with it.
Mm-hmm.
And you must like accompany that with like a water load, or would you manipulate water and sodium with that amount of carbs? Any different?
Yeah, there's a lot of intricate moving parts, and I guess I should say I always put a disclaimer with this. For those that aren't really familiar with how to do it, or aren't really familiar with how water and carbohydrates and sodium and potassium work with each other, I don't usually recommend doing this. So many people will say, oh, I'll give it a shot, and they just think, I'll just cut carbs for 4 days, and then I'll just load carbs for the day. But you really do, you're very right, Robin, you need to have water, sodium, and carbohydrates and potassium as well working in tandem at the same time. So I usually will bring water up. I'll actually bring water up about a week out, just to start acclimating the body to a higher water intake, because I don't want to throw anything to it too crazy at the last minute, because you're going to need that higher water intake, obviously, for glycogen storage, right, once those carbohydrates come into play. So I don't want to, I guess I would say carbohydrates are a variable that need to be adjusted at that last minute, but water is one that doesn't need to be adjusted at the very last minute. So I will bring water.
That's really smart.
Yeah, I'm a big believer in reduction of variables during the final week. The fewer things you can leave to chance, the better. And so I'll bring water up just to acclimate the body to the higher water intake, and I pretty much leave it there for the entire week. It's just usually around 2 to 3 gallons per day, and I'll just keep it that way all the way through Friday. And then that way the water is there when those carbohydrates start coming in a very high volume.
So I have a couple questions about this now. So does it make any difference for you if an athlete is leaner, or maybe someone came to you a little bit with not quite enough time, you didn't have quite enough time to get them in true stage condition? Will you still load or rapid backload as heavily, or do you find that the slightly less conditioned athlete will be more likely to spill? And by spill, I just mean, you start to look smoother, and maybe you have some water pockets, or just look a little softer, more bloated kind of thing.
Very good question, actually. Not a lot of people ask that, but that is very true. If someone is not fully lean, I do not use the backload, the large backload, because you are very right. The leaner someone is, the more someone's going to be able to take in those carbs without seeing any spilling. But if somebody does have pockets of fat, wherever those pockets of fat are, then you will see a blurring of that area. And I think that when there is a decent amount of subcutaneous fat there's just more area for water to sort of get stored. Yeah, collect in that area, and maybe some of the glucose would just be a little bit more likely to float around in that area there. Yeah. So yeah, it's a method that somebody just has to be absolutely peeled and literally just no pockets of fat left on them.
Yeah.
And so since you've prepped so many competitors and you've kind of refined these techniques, do you feel the need to test athletes out like earlier in the prep, say, like, or is it pretty consistent that if they are very, very lean, they'll always, like, all athletes will respond very well to like the rapid backload? Or do you test it out on an athlete just to make sure they'll respond well to it?
I usually don't test it. I would say about 95% of the bodybuilders I work with, it is right for them. And usually I can see how they will respond to it just by how they react to their high carb day. If somebody tends to get very watery, very smooth after their high carb day, then usually it'll let me know that maybe this isn't right for them. So, you know, but I will say that even people that are have to go very low carb to get lean, some people that, you know, maybe even have some insulin resistance issues, it still works for them really well.
Wow.
And so, you know, I've had some people where we have to get their carbohydrates down to 40 grams per day or something crazy during their prep, and we can still use the backload without any spilling.
That's awesome. Just while we're on the topic of people not getting quite stage ready, just going to sidestep for 1 second. Do you find that there are certain people who have just an extremely stubborn body and have an extremely difficult time getting lean?
I was going to ask this question.
And
I was waiting to ask it.
Is there any way to predict it, and what is the approach you would take with someone who comes to you like that? Because, you know, in this industry, it's all about promoting the athletes who get shredded, right? So you see all the contest prep coaches posting, you know, the same pics of the same dudes over and over, and they all have the like veins going up their ass, and like they have just like striations on their earlobes, and they all eat tons of carbs, right? So they post the genetic elite, but you know that there are clients out there who are stepping on stage over 10% too, right? So my question for you is, and by the way, I'm not hating on people, like I do the same thing. Everybody posts their best athletes for the most part, right? But have you ran into this where you have some people who just seem to have extremely stubborn metabolisms, really are genetically predisposed or somehow predisposed to keeping fat on? And yeah, is there a way to sort of overcome that? Or yeah, what do you have to say about that?
Yeah, you know that, man, you were asking some really good questions that I feel like I could talk forever about. There are, and you know, I've often found sometimes that some of these people are extremely muscular. And I talked with, like you said, John Bozzi about this as well on one of his podcasts. But I've seen this weird instance where sometimes people that are extremely muscular and actually have the capability to get extremely lean, they can, but they need to dig so much harder than some other people would probably need to. I'll use one of my clients as an example. Her name is Carrie Bolin. She's a female competitor. She's probably the leanest female competitor I've ever, not only ever coached, but I've ever seen in person. But she gets extremely lean, but we just have to push so hard. And when you work with someone like that, I think it's important to really just gauge how much physically and mentally they're able to take, because you know you always want to avoid excess, whether it be, you know, excessive, you know, caloric deficit or excessive you know, amounts of cardio. But you know, sometimes it's called for, and you just got to gauge first off where this person is able to tolerate a certain level of work and a certain, you know, caloric intake. But then beyond that, I think sometimes you need to get a little tricky. I mean, I'm not necessarily a fan of ketogenic dieting, but what I'll do with a lot of the really hard case weight loss people is I'll go as far as I can with, I would say, a more traditional fat loss method of cutting fats down, keeping protein moderate, and then just chipping away from carbs from there. But once carbs and fats start to get pretty low, I've had really good success with, I would say, finishing with a ketogenic diet. And when I say keto, not just, you know, not what a lot of people think of ketogenic dieting, where you just go low carb and high protein, but real ketogenic dieting where you go almost lower.
Ketosis.
Yeah, where you actually look to achieve ketosis. And, you know, a lot of people think, you need lower protein to accomplish that. So, I'll even have some female competitors where I drop them down to 100 grams of protein a day or 90 grams of protein for the day, and I'll raise fats up to 80 grams. And then it's almost like starting over, where I had their calories maybe down to 1,100 calories, and they're just stuck. I'll sort of start over, and I switch them over to ketosis, and I'll bump their calories up to 1,300, 1,400, maybe even 1,500, and they'll start dropping again with that ratio, and then I sort of work the calories back down from there while in ketosis.
Do you think that's the initial drop is like glycogen depletion, or do you think it's true like fat loss?
I do think it's true fat loss. I mean, obviously there's some water weight that comes off with that, but I'm often surprised to find that they will continue to lose for several weeks, even on the higher caloric intake. And it's been, this is only something I really started doing, I would say, in the past 2-3 years of that, finishing with keto dieting. And it's been really good. And I think it also has to do with just from a greater energy output during training and during cardio, because the calories come up but insulin levels stay low, and with the caloric intake coming up, they're just able to train harder, they're able to push harder during their cardio, and then it just leads to greater fat loss.
Mm-hmm. I feel like I am so carb sensitive, I would just not, I don't know because I've never tried it, but I feel like I would just be a zombie on a keto diet. Like, I feel like I wouldn't be able to push myself as hard. Do you ever find anyone that just really doesn't respond well to it, or is it just...
I don't. I would say I don't, but that's only because I use it so rarely. I only use those in the
extreme cases.
Yeah, 3% of people that you just can't get them as lean as they need to be with traditional methods. So I would say that finishing with keto is like the last resort.
Right. Yeah.
To go to. So
I'm just digging at you. I guess I'm not. I'm just curious.
No, and I totally. if I tried to do a keto method, I would be a complete zombie as well. And you know what? I think a lot of these people as well, the ones that tend to need to do that, they tend to be more muscular. They tend to be the people that are more muscular. So they're almost like a different breed of athlete. We've seen those genetic elite, and Jeff, I know you've seen some of the guys in the IFPA and WNBF that are just so big and so massive, and I have some females that are just extra muscular, and they can almost take what is seemingly an endless amount of work. You give them so much hit and you give them so much training, and they just really never seem to display the signs of overtraining, as it may be. And so when they switch to keto dieting, it's almost like it's no big thing to them.
Just straight machines.
Yeah.
Cliff, I'm sorry for all the tangents, man, but everything just keeps popping up, and while I have your knowledge at my disposal, I just want to take advantage of it for myself and the listeners. I have a question for you about striations, because I notice a lot of your competitors have striated glutes, feathered triceps, vastus lateralis, vastus medialis, all feathered. I'm the type of guy that I can get lean and stay comfortably lean. I would say probably between 8 to 10% very comfortably. But I've never really been able to get the veins in my glutes, really, really striated triceps. It's just almost like there's always that last bit of fat, and no matter how hard I dig, it's I just can't quite get to the level of some of these guys that you've put on stage. Do you find that glute striations, let's say, or tricep striations, there's a genetic thing there? So some guys just have good genetics to have deep cut striations, and they can have that really shredded appearance without, say, getting super, super lean? Or do you find that it is just a case of how lean you get? And is there any approach or recommendation you would say for someone, say, like me, who struggles with that extra 2 or 3%, whether that be more contest prep time, or is it some approach at the end? Or what do you have to say about that whole thing I just spewed at you?
No, I actually think it's a combination of a lot of those factors you named. Sometimes it does come down to there's just a little bit more. And honestly, a lot of people ask me a lot of questions about peak week and all that, and they get really excited about the different, backload approaches. But I think, you know this more than anything. The biggest thing you can do to make the biggest impact on stage is really push yourself farther than what you think you should go. So sometimes it is just a matter of losing that last 2 pounds. But of course there is a genetic component to it. You know, so the same way some people have, you know, different shaped muscle bellies and, you know, muscle insertions, you're going to have different looks in terms of the striations of the muscle. And so I think that's also a component, but also you're a young guy, right? How old are you?
24.
Oh yeah, you're young. So I also see age as a big component to that. You know, muscle maturity, the density of and the look of someone that has been training for a longer period, it just tends to look different. And I can't even 100% say what that is, like what causes it.
About that, we were discussing this like probably last week and just like kind of arguing over our like what we thought it was. But I thought that it was because the body is just more willing to let go of the last bit of sub-Q fat. That was my opinion. And then Jeff said that no, he thinks it's that the muscles are actually more dense. But you just, to me, just like on like a 40-year-old's physique, like the skin just looks thinner to me. It's like there's less collagen or something. I don't know. I just think that it's a skin thickness thing. And that, but I don't know for sure.
I agree with both of you actually. And I always tell people like, imagine, you know, like factory workers and laborers that maybe have never touched a weight in their entire life, but they work.
So mean.
Yeah, and their forearms are just jacked, and you know they just have these huge striated forearms.
They have papery skin, like
Yeah.
it's just different skin, in my opinion.
Yeah. Sometimes I'll have some younger clients that are maybe 21, 22 that are absolutely massive. They're genetic freaks in their own right, but they, you know, they'll say I want to look like so and so. Maybe another one of my clients that's, you know, 38, you know, 42, something along those lines. I'm like, you're not gonna look like that. You may be every bit as big, but you're not gonna look that dense because it just doesn't happen that quickly. So you know, for people that I would say are a little discouraged with their striations, you know, get as lean as you possibly can, and you may just have to give it time. The other last thing I would say might help as a component of that is getting lean, extra lean early, and then bringing food back up for at least a good 3 to 4 weeks before peak week, because I think that, you know, you can, no matter how small it may be, increase your muscle mass that you've lost a little bit going into a show, and you know that increased muscle mass, if you do it slowly without putting on any fat, can sort of push out against the skin a little bit more tightly and show off some of the striations that you do have.
Yeah, cool. That actually helps a lot. Just need to keep being more patient. Stop wanting to look like guys 10 years older than you.
And selling yourself short. You always do that. You basically described yourself as being like 10% on stage, and he wasn't. He had glute striations.
Yeah, I did, but
he's
like
just comparing himself to like.
I know, but I've never seen. I don't know why. I mean, I like fat distribution and variability in fat distribution is a real thing, and for me, I just feel like it goes on my triceps and my butt. And, like, I swear I'm a female, man, because, like, this is the same problem that females have when they get lean.
Oh, yeah, and this is actually a good segue into the burning question that I have for you, Cliff. And it is, do you have some females where they just have terrible lower body stubborn fat? And if so, have you changed an approach? Like, I know, like, specifically for these women, I know Lyle has written a book on this, and I've actually read it. And I was curious to know if anyone actually applied his theories or what you think about that.
You know, I haven't read Lyle's book and suggestions on the subject, so unfortunately I don't know what he recommends.
I can say it really quickly. It's a combination of supplements. It's yohimbine and caffeine, and if you're not in, you know, it's such and such a natural organization, ephedrine, and you take that before your cardio fasted.
But he gives a protocol for no supplements as well. And
yeah,
it's just like
there's a bunch of different
no
protocols, but I'm
before.
just giving the basic one. and then you do HIIT for like 20 minutes or something. Then you do a bunch of lifts, which is supposed to like burn off the fatty acids that you liberated from the HIIT. And then you finish off with like, I think, a couple more little intervals or something.
It's supposed to trick like the different receptors on the stubborn fat cells, because he thinks that the stubborn fat cells are like have a different physiology like than regular fat cells. It's
interesting, like the nerdy side of me really likes it, but then at the same time it's just a grueling protocol, and I've heard some other guys sort of, you know, brush it under the table and be like, you know, it's probably not the most practical thing.
But there are women who are like that. And
exactly.
I just want to know if there's any hope for them, because it's like their body fat just seems to come off their upper body and almost just like stick on their lower body, or they just only lose body fat from their upper body. Like I've seen female natural bodybuilders on stage like that, and I'm just like, oh, I know that it's real, and like I'm just wondering if you have encountered that.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that, because I actually just did a talk on this. I wish I had visual representation here, but you know, I've heard protocols similar to what Lyle recommends, I guess. I can't necessarily say it's wrong, but I would say that I've tried similar protocols to that in the past, and I just can't say that I noticed any big difference. In the end, I think what it comes down to is continuing to push even when your naturally lean areas have already leaned out. The way I look at it is that once body fat stores in a particular area are tapped out, the body has to pull that energy from somewhere. Mm-hmm. And so if you keep digging, it eventually has to come off. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. It's sort of like if I take $500 and I put it in one bank, and I take $500 and I put it in another bank, and I continue withdrawing $10 every week out of only one account, you know, and until that account is totally depleted. Maybe that's some female's upper body. Eventually, if I keep needing $10 every week, I'm going to have to start taking it from my other account. You know what I mean? So if you just keep continuing to create the demand for energy, it has to start coming off the lower body. But you're right, unfortunately, that that some people just have very unfortunate, and I'll even use myself as an example. As a male bodybuilder, I have terrible body fat distribution. I tend to have pretty lean legs, but it is all stored around my stomach.
So you have male, like strong male fat patterning.
That's what Lyle's called male in his book, yeah.
I get glute striations in my side poses before my abs are even close to in, and I have the anti-men's physique. Put it that way. I would make the worst men's physique competitor, and so you know, I think in a situation like that, if you're a female out there and you get to the point where your upper body's just really lean, and you cannot, you still have quite a bit left on your legs, my advice is just keep going. Just keep losing, and you'll find that it'll start coming off.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah, there was one girl that I was following, and she actually just did Canadian Nationals. I watched her on stage, and she had done a whole prep for the Arnold. She did the Arnold Amateur, and her upper body was completely shredded, like more lean than any other girl I saw on the Arnold stage. And her lower body just was like probably looked like 6 weeks out or something, and she knows this, like she posted about it and everything. And then she continued to prep since the Arnold, like digging for like over, I think her whole prep was like 8 months or something until now Nationals, and she finally just decided to start prepping, and she only just started to get like her legs lean. And it's just like bikini? So much, yeah, bikini. So much dieting, like for so long. So
you know what's one trick that I'll actually use is if I have a bikini competitor where her lower body isn't really keeping up, and you essentially have to push to the point where her lower body is lean enough, but her upper body is maybe become too lean for bikini.
Yeah.
In a situation, I'll do with that is this is the only situation where I will cut water for a competitor for a few days so she softens up. You know, as you and I have seen, I'm sure we've seen the look of a competitor that cuts water and they get soft.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I'll use that, because if her upper body's too lean, I'll cut water and I'll reduce water pretty low for a few days before the show, and her upper body gets softer.
Oh, cool. That's really good advice. I'm glad I asked the question.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. I agree. I thought you were gonna say I would get her to stop training her upper body. So seriously, that's what I would. I mean, yeah, like dudes. I mean, people flatten out when they don't train, right? So you could tone back on the upper body training, or at least the intensity.
And I've seen a lot of competitors do that, actually, like a lot of bikini competitors who just have like good upper body development and just find that their legs are kind of the last to lean out. But I don't know like how like science based that is, but yeah.
All right, Cliff, so let's just quickly go through all this peak week stuff. I think we've touched on a lot of really cool topics already. So you do the rapid backload for most people. What about fats? Do you also load them, deplete them, keep them the same, and the same for protein?
During the rapid backload, people get really nervous when I say I do a deplete, because obviously I deplete carbohydrates for a few days to create that super compensation effect when I load. So people get really nervous when I say deplete. I don't really do a caloric deplete. It's just a carbohydrate deplete. So typically I'll keep calories around the same of their dieting levels, and I'll just decrease carbohydrates and I'll distribute among fats and proteins. So fats and proteins will usually come up during their deplete portion, just so I can make sure that they're not losing muscle during this deplete phase. During loading portion, protein comes way down, because I'm just trying to keep calories from getting way too high. And so proteins and fats are mostly just trace from the carbohydrate foods that are coming in. I do have some people, take bites of chicken throughout the day, and I'm going to be totally honest, this is a little bit more of the bro in me trying to get out, in that I just feel uncomfortable having somebody go the entire day without any specific protein source.
My stomach would probably get upset. Like I know Jeff's stomach gets upset like on meat, like when we do powerlifting meets and we just snack on carbs all day. So
yeah, and so I mean, I don't know, how do I put this delicately? Sometimes I find people before shows, as nerves start to get to them, like during peak week and stuff like that, they have trouble going to the bathroom in the final days. It's not typically an issue when you're taking in 1,200 grams of carbs. They're able to keep the digestive system has to move, and so,
yeah, really though.
It stimulates everything pretty well.
Yeah,
that's actually a good note there. Keep that in mind.
Yeah, good idea. Actually, I think I need to go to the bathroom now. Yes. So, all right. So, what about for sodium and water? That should tie this all together.
Sodium, much like water, people have this tendency to want to cut sodium because they think they're going to drop subcutaneous water, which is ridiculous. And they just don't realize how much sodium plays into the carb up process. Everything I do is really, it's not about trying to, because I hate when people use the term trick the body, and they think this rapid backload is a way to trick the body, but it's really working with the body to create a favorable situation. And so
you actually use human physiology to determine your practices.
Yeah. So, for me, it all comes down to carbohydrate storage. I feel like, intracellular, extracellular water is going to fall where it needs to be, as long as you carb up properly. And so, when it comes to taking in 1,000 or 1,200 grams of carbs in a single day, timing becomes very important. And, for those that aren't familiar, I know, Jeff, I've actually seen your YouTube video on peaking on why not to cut water and sodium, and it was very good and very thorough. And so, people don't realize that sodium works with glucose to transport. And so when carbs are coming in a very high amount, when you're trying to put them in that time and have them assimilate in a timely fashion and be stored by the time someone's on stage, you need a high amount of sodium. and to make it effective and to make it timely.
Right.
The glucose, it's a co-transporter with sodium.
Yes, yeah, you know, SGLT1.
Boom.
Jeff
And
had
so,
to drop
IV
that
man.
biochem bomb.
Cliff said it too. I just said
Did you? Oh, Jeff always needs to win on those, just by the way. Like, we're both well, he has a degree in biochemistry, and I have, like, a partial degree in biochemistry and in engineering. But anyway, so, like, he obviously, like, my degree is only partial, Jeff's is full, so he always feels the need to remind me of that by dropping, like, all of the transporter.
I'm just a know-it-all. I'm like it when
how
songs
do
come on.
you remember that? It's like the GT415, probably. I don't even know. Like, I can't recall any of them. Anyways, I'll shut up now.
Well, no. So, you know, people, it always cracks me up when people just completely restrict their sodium. They go no sodium for 4 days while they're trying to load their carbohydrates. So what I'll usually do is, I would say sodium tolerance levels vary from person to person. So during prep, I let people eat whatever amount of sodium feels comfortable to them. But during the final few weeks, I kind of start raising it up slowly, just to increase their tolerance and, you know, make sure their body is able to process the amount of, much like what I did with the water, process the amount that I'm going to give them. So usually I will increase one last time during peak week, and I'll bring it up to a pretty high level, but not so much that they're going to see edema. And then during the load portion, and I'll try to put this without confusing too many people, but during the load portion, it becomes pretty crucial to balance sodium and potassium, because you don't want those numbers to get too far away from each other, from where they're natural. So I sort of balance my timing of my sodium pulses with, because I use sweet potatoes quite a bit during my load portion, and sweet potatoes are extremely high in potassium. So then I sort of need to keep a really high sodium intake to keep up with this really high potassium intake that I have coming in. So it's not uncommon for, in the week leading up to the deplete portion, I'll keep sodium, you know, for males and females, probably around 3,000 to anywhere to up to 6,000, depending on how much somebody has been taking in, milligrams of sodium. And then during the load day, on that load day, anywhere from 9,000 to 12,000 milligrams of sodium on the load day. And you know, and a lot of people, that makes a lot of people panic. But you know, an acute burst of sodium like that is not gonna cause many problems. The kidneys should be able to flush out any excess that is coming in, as long as you're taking in sufficient water, and as long as it doesn't continue on for too long. And then on show day, I back off on sodium. I'll hit people with a dose right before stage, but you know, I kind of use that load day as the day to load, and then on show day, I don't push food too hard, and I really don't give much more sodium, because the body should have had everything it needed the previous day, and then you'll maybe hit them with a little bit more just before stage to bring out that vascularity, and then they're good to go.
That's a nice approach. I like that, because even with myself, I found that when I compete, and I have taken a very similar, more aggressive approach like this my last competition season, and I felt I peaked really well. But after the mayhem, after 2 full days of high sodium, by the time the night show rolled around, I noticed
How much did we calculate you had?
It was around 12,000. It was like the upper end of what
grams,
he
but
said.
you didn't have any potassium, I don't think. Like, you didn't eat any vegetables.
No, my potassium wouldn't have been as high as what Cliff would recommend for sure, and that might have been a part of it. But what I've noticed with myself is that
extreme edema.
but it's like it's very time sensitive. So all day Friday, I won't notice any spill at all, and then even all day Saturday for prejudging and everything, I didn't notice anything. But then that night,
fast forward next day, swollen ankles.
One of those days where you take your socks off and you see that ring around. You're like,
and like the pooches under the pecs.
Yeah, okay.
It was kind of funny, but really, really, really scary.
Yeah. So this brings me to my next question for you, Cliff. Have you ever seen someone spill from this approach for when you were trying to peak them? And if so, is there any way to counteract that if they have, say, multiple shows lined up?
You know what? I've never had anyone spill, because I always play it. You know, and I'll say this: some people always view this as risky, this method. But I will say that this method, once you learn how everything works together, is honestly way more consistent, brings way more consistent results than my front loading or the subtle back loading that I would do for like a bikini competitor. I mean, it's like clockwork. I know what when someone looks at a certain way on, Friday midway through their load, I know precisely what they're going to look like the very next morning when they wake up. So it's been the most consistent. But just to be on the safe side, the first time I ever peak somebody, I always aim a little bit lower than what I think they can take in. I'd rather have somebody be a little bit flat than spill, obviously.
Right.
So, if I suspect somebody can take in 1,200 grams of carbohydrates, I may aim just slightly under 1,100, or go with 1,050 or something along those lines. And then if they have multiple shows lined up, which most of my clients, I do encourage them to do more than one show in a season, I will then maybe increase for their second and third shows. However, I would say the instance that was the scariest for me as a coach was, are you familiar with Brian Ahlstrom?
Yeah.
Brian, good friend of mine. I didn't know him too well. He became a really good friend. I prepped him in 2012. He woke up the morning of his first pro show, and he was flatter than any client I have ever, which seems strange because he had taken in so many carbohydrates the day before. I think he took in about 1,000 that day, but he was just so flat. The 1,000 carbs did not do the trick. and we were scrambling. Usually I kind of like to use pretty basic foods on the morning of the show just to keep people's digestive system from having any curveballs. But we were scrambling. We were having them chug Gatorade. We were having him eat Pop-Tarts and Reese's Cups, just anything he could get his hands on that had a lot of carbs and a lot of calories. And we were really lucky that it was an afternoon show. It was like 2 p.m. and he filled out, I would say, like he started looking on point about noon. And, he actually ended up winning his pro debut. But, as a coach, you'll be the first one to admit nobody's perfect. And I think that was the one incident where I woke up the morning of the show and I was like panicked at the results that I saw because he was just so flat, and we finally got it together before stage.
Is that because you like lowballed his carbs, do you think? Or was it just random, like he just didn't respond like you suspected him to?
That was a situation where, and in 2012, that was 2012, so I'd only been using this peak for about a year at that point. And at that point of using this method, I didn't quite understand or see the telltale signs of somebody who, when you eat a lot of food, you're going to see that, that short-term rise in metabolic rate over the course of the day. And some people also, when they start having food come in, they just get a lot more hyperactive and will just do more things. And, I didn't see Brian's capability to hold, not just store so many carbohydrates, but also he kept just telling me how hot he was all day. He was just,
oh my God, that's me.
Yeah. And so, somebody, you'll see that instant, and so my guess is that if you're that same way, when you start carbing up, sometimes it maybe takes more than what you would anticipate.
Yeah, so, I just take forever to spill over after the show. I just I'm only 100 pounds on stage, and I can eat we did an all-you-can-eat cruise, and I was still stage lean by the end of it. It took me that long because I just burn up, and my metabolism just reverse adapts, I guess you could call it, very, very quickly.
Yeah, and that heat, you can feel it almost coming off of their skin.
I can't sleep because I'm burning up.
Yeah, and Brian was telling me how hot he was. And at that stage, like I said, I'd only been doing this peak for a year. I didn't pick up on the signs that we needed to give him more. So, that was, for me as a coach, that was a good learning experience.
That's really cool. That's really interesting. I thought it was just me.
All right, so I think that covers everything I wanted to talk about peak week. Unless, Robin, there was something else you wanted to say?
No, I think I asked enough questions.
I did post on Instagram, Cliff, that I was having you on the show, and I just asked if people had any questions for you. So if you don't mind, I'll just maybe read out a couple of these, and then we'll quickly touch on reverse dieting and then call it a wrap.
Yeah, no problem.
So we said Ready to Go asks, after a successful extended off season, does food capacity increase dramatically from the increased muscle mass, or is it more along the lines of it goes up a bit, but you're stuck with the hand you were dealt? So I think what he means by that is at the end of the cut, or when you start your cut, are you going to have an increased food capacity and be able to diet on more calories, or are you kind of like, you're going to hit your genetic bedrock in terms of calories once you start to cut, and you're just going to pretty much cut on the same macros again, if we're looking at like sequential seasons, so like consecutive seasons back to back, say, or whatever?
You know what? I think that it's a little bit of both. I think some people can really increase their food intake more so than others, as long as they're diligent and avoid binging and getting too heavy quickly. But just like muscle mass, all of us have different genetic potentials in terms of muscle mass. All of us have different genetic potentials in terms of our food intake. And so, it's a nice thought, and I'm sure we're going to talk about this a little bit with the reverse dieting portion. And some people like to think that with reverse dieting, you can essentially work food up almost endlessly and just tolerate anything. Well, I mean, I guess you could, but you'll keep getting fatter. And so, which explains why you see some very obese people that can take in 20,000 calories a day. So
my body just is like, I don't want to store any more fat.
Yeah. So I mean, at the end of the day, I think you can maximize the hand you've been dealt. I'll put it that way. But it depends on how heavy you're willing to let yourself get in the off season. Some people can really brag about how much they can take in, or I see some coaches that can, like you talked about, they'll brag about, I have this client dieting on this amount of carbs, which is always nice, but it doesn't mean anyone else can do that.
Yeah. Or that they're not suffering, because like those same people just might like we've met someone who dieted on 400 grams of carbs at only like 160 pounds body weight, and he was still dying.
Oh, great point. I've actually found, and I kind of joke with my clients about this, the ones that actually have the highest carb intakes are usually the biggest babies.
Yeah, it's so true, man.
When it comes to yeah, they're always the ones that are whining the most, and I'm like, people would kill for your carbohydrate intake.
Yeah.
Okay, I just want to say this because people will be like, you know what, if you have high carbs, like you can be one of those guys who diets on 300 grams of carbs. If you're one of those guys who diets on 100 grams of carbs, it sucks for everyone. Like, you're both going to suffer and you're both going to go through it. Like, okay, all right, fine, but the dude who has 300 grams of carbs is always better. Like, it's always better to be in that condition. Yes, it is. You get more food. Like, it has to be at least better.
You saw how I was, like, a couple weeks ago. Like, for bikini competitors, I ate a lot, but I was dying. Like,
yeah, you were dying, but all else being equal, it's always better to have 200 extra grams of carbs a day. Like, at least you get to be more creative with your food, and you get to have more options for food.
I just binged on my meals.
I mean, I'm not saying as a matter of physiology you don't feel worse, but like from a psychological standpoint, or even just like if you just imagine everything else being equal, would you rather have 300 grams of carbs or 100 grams of carbs? Like, being on poverty macros is always worse. Yeah. Like, if you feel like shit, and you're on 300 grams of carbs,
I just can't imagine,
it's better than feeling like shit and being on 100 grams.
Yeah, I am sure it would be in concept, but like you wouldn't be on those anyway. I don't know.
Yeah. Anyway, I will acknowledge that people suffer on like whatever intake they're on if they're lean and like at the end of a cut and everything. Yes, absolutely.
No, I agree. And also having all those extra carbs, it brings with it a lot of lifestyle freedoms. You can go out and a lot of those times people have pretty forgiving metabolisms as well. They can go out and maybe estimate a few meals more easily than somebody on 50 grams of carbs could.
I mean, that is true.
Exactly. Yeah.
But I don't know, I found for me it was just like it didn't matter. I would just burn through the carbs in my meals and then just still be like ravenously hungry. But
yeah. Vince Nuygen, I apologize, I actually don't know how to pronounce that. Nugent, okay.
Yeah.
He says, about the metabolic capacity question, like I think it's the latter. Have you seen Lovato's poverty macros? And I've noticed the trend, Cliff, with my athletes and just with the community generally, that people who have to diet on low macros, even if they do a diligent reverse diet, are the people who have to diet on low macros. Have you ever seen a counterexample to this where you've had someone do one prep on really low macros, then you have run a successful reverse diet and have done another prep and gotten just as lean on higher macros, or is that extremely rare?
You know, I would say if they dieted correctly the first time, and then dieted correctly again the second time, they're probably going to end up around the same area.
Yeah.
You know, I would say the only time that I think it can be improved, I think it a lot of times comes down to length of time between preps to allow yourself to get back to your previous level, at least your previous level of muscle mass. I think the only time you see people that will have to diet, they'll almost diet on lower calories is when they do 2 contest preps too close together. Maybe that's from anabolic hormones and, muscle mass not reaching the high levels that they should have, and maybe fat loss hormones not rebounding the way they should have as well. But usually it's not going to go the other way unless they dieted really poorly the first time.
So I'm just going to take one more question and then maybe one quick question on training. Cliff, by the way, do you do training programming for your athletes as well, or is it more so just nutrition and contest prep?
I do training.
You do training too, okay.
Yeah, I work with some power lifters. I wouldn't say it's necessarily my main clientele, but I do work with training programs with, I would say, probably about 80% of my clients.
Oh, cool. Okay. So Lysandra Vuong, sorry if I'm butchering that, asks, how would you go about programming a female's off season who is predisposed to fat gain instead of muscle gain? That is, should she bulk or not?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that? She's predisposed to what?
Okay, so we have a female who's in her off season and she's predisposed to put on fat very easily. Should she do a bulk when she's trying to gain muscle or not? Just maintain, or how do you approach that?
Off season, in terms of how heavy I'll let someone get, I always call it the sweet spot. And people that are naturally heavier than others. Some people are just more prone to be heavier and have higher body fat levels. To have a successful off season, you obviously want to keep someone as lean as they can possibly be, while still feeling comfortable. I always kind of say it comes down to a few things: performance in the gym, energy in terms of making sure they just feel good, because if you're so lean that your anabolic hormones are suppressed, like testosterone and things like that, if they're suppressed, then you're not going to feel good. And then the mental aspect of, you should also, obviously we all want to look like we do during prep all the time, but you should be a comfortable weight where you don't feel uncomfortable in your own skin. So I would say, for the person asking the question, try to hit those criteria where you're strong and performing well in the gym, and where you are at least content with the way you look in the off season, and you don't feel miserable, like it's a struggle to maintain that weight, and that's probably your sweet spot.
Right. I think that's good advice. I do like a more of a slow gain approach for people who tend to store fat more easily rather than a fast bulk, and that's probably the approach you take with most people anyway.
If they're planning on competing the next season, like if they're not planning on competing for a couple of years or something, then if they're a hard gainer, like if they find it difficult to add muscle but easy to add fat, it's just unfortunate about the fat. But I think that if their body fat set point is a little higher and they're not competing for a couple of years, I personally would not see a huge issue with it. But
no, that's a great point. If somebody's not competing for 4 years, some guys and girls say they want a 4-year off season. Well, you don't need to monitor that weight too closely if they want to get a little bit heavier.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a balance between adding muscle in the off season and then making sure you're still able to get lean again for the next show. But if your only goal is to maximize how much muscle you put on, and you don't care about conditioning, then I would say that it would be better to be a little more aggressive with adding in calories and not worrying so much about the body fat. But
yeah.
And so one last question here. Leo BVT asked that if you have someone, say, who has a really weak body part, would you recommend utilizing a 4 to 6 week specialization training phase where you overload volume on that one body part and put everything else at the bare minimum volume?
I don't think it necessarily needs to be set for a certain phase, But overall, I think that's a good approach for weak body parts. As long as you don't overload the volume in that area so much that you become imbalanced, and you start to have really bad imbalances. But yeah, I mean, I'll use myself as an example. My legs are my strength, and my upper body's always struggled to grow. So this past off season, I've lowered my volume for my legs to, like, as you put it, bare minimum, and have really upped the volume and the intensity on my upper body to sort of save my energy and my recovery ability for the areas that need it most. Because usually overtraining isn't a localized issue; it's more of a systemic issue in terms of recovery ability. So that I definitely think that is a good approach. Guys love to train their strengths hard and intensely because everybody loves doing what they're good at. So you see guys that have huge deadlifts and really good legs and back. They go in and they squat like crazy and love to brag about it. But they probably shouldn't be putting as much effort into that and focus on the areas where they're generally just not good. Yeah. So I totally agree. That's a good question and very good point.
Yeah, and I'll just share my experience with this. I do find it to be the case that a lot of guys in the natural community have really nagging upper chests and side delts. I don't know what that is, but I've noticed that a lot, especially with a lot of the guys that come to me, even not necessarily competitive guys. But I think that that's something that really brings about that just thick look, old school bodybuilder type look, that X frame, and then the big scallop chest. So sometimes what I'll do with these guys is give them a short 4 to 6 week overreaching phase where they're hitting their incline presses, incline cable crossovers, really a lot of exercises just to target that clavicular head of the pec and develop that upper chest as much as possible and sort of shock the system, to use a bro term. And I have found this to be effective, increasing the volume and frequency in this way. But like you said, Cliff, if it happens for too long of a period of time, then that the amount of training volume dedicated to the weak point can displace training volume dedicated to other parts, and
or cause a shoulder imbalance,
or cause postural problems, exactly, which is why I said that it's usually
just
a truncated period of time. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, and we all know the look, and like you said, postural imbalance. Guys that train, they're like, okay, great, I'll train chest 4 or 5 days a week, and then they start getting that gorilla look.
Yeah, I will. I will qualify that by saying that I always balance it out with at least a 1-to-1 ratio of pushing to pulling, even if I do that program. So if they're doing incline pressing 2 or 3 times per week, they're always doing rope face pulls after it, or wide grip cable rows or something like that to balance it out. Yeah, so that's just common sense programming. Yeah. All right, Cliff. So we're gonna quickly touch on some reverse dieting stuff here. So in case there are new listeners to the show that have come to hear what Cliff has to say, my view historically on this, based on my own experience and the experience of the people that I've coached, is that it's a smart idea to, after your competition, I use the analogy of, instead of just tiptoeing your way around the swimming pool, or instead of just belly flopping your way into the swimming pool, I like to sort of slowly wade my way back in and then just get on with your swim. And that is the analogy to, in your off season, instead of just reverse dieting ad nauseum for an undetermined amount of time, not really getting anywhere with it. Instead of doing that, you sort of bring your calories back up to maintenance within a couple weeks or even right away, and then just start increasing from there. I listened to a podcast you did with Barbell One, and I think you maybe have a slightly different vantage point than me, and maybe you can talk about what approach it is that you take to your athletes post-show. And I'm completely open-minded when it comes to this kind of stuff, and I recognize that you've had more experience in working with bodybuilders than I have, and so your opinion on this is highly valued. So I'm interested to hear what it is that you have to say on this.
Well, and actually, before we did this, because we had talked about this going in, I actually went and I looked and watched your video, and I would say my approach is almost in between where you're at and where I would say the typical quote-unquote reverse dieters are. because I do see what you're saying, and you know your points are extremely valid. Where some people reverse diet so slowly that their bodies recover so slowly, and you know their anabolic hormones do not recover quickly. For those that aren't familiar, you know that case study on Chris Foz was a
Yeah.
example. It took him nearly 6 months to get his hormone levels back to normal.
That's a bodybuilder's
Yeah,
name.
yeah.
We couldn't figure out who the natural bodybuilder was.
Uh, and even you know, for those that don't know, Pete Fitchen is a client of mine.
Yeah.
Pete is should be completing his PhD here in about 2 months, and he's done a case study on himself, and you know he showed that it took a little while for his muscle mass to return. And I actually have a client right now that is looking to finish some research on his diet and then his reverse as well.
Oh, cool.
And so yeah, you know, I'm hoping to see one on a female soon here. I really am.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, really though.
Let
So.
us know.
Yeah, I've actually been putting the word out to some of my clients that are in school now. I'm like, hey, you know, get on that.
I know Lauren Conlon does research while she's doing her master's, and I hope she does something like that.
Yeah, it would be great. So, you know, it can take so long for those hormones to recover when you're just, like you said, tiptoeing the food up. The other approach, so if you know, with your approach, you just jump right back up with calories. I like that approach better than the slow approach. Now, I'm going to qualify myself here as saying I've changed my viewpoint on this in the last few years. I used to be the guy that was bringing carbs up 10 grams at a time. And, you know, I kind of slowly came to the realization that you did, that I was hurting people more in the long run. It actually became it almost became a test of will for my clients, where who could stay on their diet the longest without cheating. And so, you know, I've changed my viewpoint on that, and I do bigger increases. But the reason I still take a more moderate approach, where instead of adding 10 grams or instead of jumping all the way, you know, back up with 1,000 extra calories or whatever it may be, I'll maybe do increases of 30 to 50 grams of carbohydrates. Because with a few, just, you know, this isn't published work or anything like that, but I've done a few tests with some of my clients that have access to good body fat testing, and I've used a various array of methods. You know, some people are just using calipers. Some people are using DEXA, some people, you know, BodPod and things like that. But obviously nothing is 100% accurate when you're talking body fat tests. But you can obviously gain back that muscle mass that you lost during prep so quickly. There is huge advantage to going fast. But the only thing I've seen is that if I use a slightly more moderate approach, I can almost see, I see situations where people gain almost pure muscle and no fat in those early stages. So I'll maybe use the first 3 or 4 weeks to be a little bit more conservative, to sort of give them a platform to where they can, and we'll kind of see, you know, I talk about that sweet spot in the off season, where maybe they'll be able to hold a slightly leaner sweet spot in this off season than they did in the past, which sets us up for the next prep of being able to have to lose less fat than we did. Right. So that would be my big, you know, my big issue with that. And I'm going to also say, ideally, my goal with all of my clients is to essentially start their reverse before their show. With every single one of my clients, I aim to have them 100% lean, ready to go at least 3 or 4 weeks out from their show, which gives me 2 or 3 weeks of reversing food up before peak week even starts. So like I said, you can regrow some muscle tissue, and then you're even on your way to reversing before your show even gets there. So that's my only reasoning for that, is still being a little bit moderate, that I can maybe put on, because, you know, after you've lost so much muscle, have you ever read the case study by Pete Fitchen?
Yeah, I have actually. Yeah.
Okay, he didn't cover hormone panels in that one, but he lost quite a bit of muscle mass in that, because, you know, and I also say he was prepped by Lane that year as well as was Chris during his case study.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, and Pete isn't as genetically gifted as Chris, I would say, in terms of muscle mass, so he ended up losing quite a bit more muscle. Right. I want to say of the 30 pounds he lost, about somewhere around 14 pounds of it was muscle.
Yeah, I remember that, because there have been 3 case studies. Actually, I think Pete did and a post or what's it called? I don't know, a piece in Alan Aragon's research review a couple of months ago, if I recall correctly. And I think he covered, it was 3 case studies, and it was his where the greatest amount of lean mass losses were seen. And he speculated about why that was the case, but yeah, I'll let you finish.
Oh, I didn't even read that one. I need to.
Oh yeah, you should. It's
send that over. Yeah. Although he's speaking with me at a seminar in a few weeks, and he's actually going to cover physiological effects of contest prepping, so he'll probably bring it up there. Cool. So, you know, in someone like a case like that where, you know, a great deal of muscle mass has been lost, you know, we've seen that the muscle mass can come back so quickly, and because, you know, the actually, what's his name? Greg Nuckols just wrote a great article about myonuclei, that for those that haven't read it. And so, you know, in a situation like that, where I think it's one of the few times where I almost think you can either maybe even lose fat or at least maintain fat and gain pure muscle, almost see a recompositioning. Because if you add in 40 or 50 grams of carbohydrates, it's going to give you a lot more energy to train harder. And especially if you put them around that workout time, a lot more energy to train harder. And then you train harder and you increase your load by that strength going back up, it creates the demand for more muscle mass again. Mm-hmm. And so then, you know, those calories, I once again, this is a little bit of just like extrapolating, you know, things from the things that I've read, but, you know, I don't have any 100% concrete proof for this, a little bit of a hypothesis on my end. But you create the demand for more muscle mass, then those calories you've introduced will maybe in the early phases of reverse dieting go almost solely towards muscle mass. Right. So that's where I'm from.
Cool. Yeah, no, I like that approach. I mean, I can get totally on board with that, right? For me, I come at this question more from a psychological perspective, maybe even more so than a physiological perspective, just because I've seen so many people struggle so profoundly with a reverse diet, and I just ask the question, you know, at what end? Because eventually you're going to settle into, you know, some set point where your body tends to be comfortable anyway, and I'd rather get there sooner rather than later, and then get on with it, right? Start building your muscle, start feeling better, allow your, you know, body fat to redistribute, and just have your physique looking better more quickly. And that doesn't mean that you go out and binge and then you get all this water retention and you just blow up like a blowfish. But I think that maybe, you know, stepping on the gas pedal a little bit more post-show is the way to go in my experience for psychological reasons. If you
overshoot a little bit, then it's worth the, like, them getting a better relationship with food a little quicker, I guess.
Yeah,
I can
because really, I work with a lot of women, and like I find that, yeah.
Post-show is a difficult period psychologically. Like, you know, you've put everything into the competition, and you're noticing your body change, and I've seen, you know, people will say to me, and I've seen it myself, and I've seen it in a lot of my athletes, if you're, say, 165 pounds at 5 weeks out, then you do your show at like 160, and then 5 weeks post-show, you're back up to 165. Those two 165s look very different in my experience. And you can look, you know, harder going into the competition than you will be coming out the other side sometimes. And I attribute that mostly to water retention and just strange body fat distribution. So like after you gain fat in the post-show period, you might gain it in a different place than your body tends to store it, and then over time it will start to redistribute. I don't know if that's something that you've noticed, Cliff, but yeah.
Oh, absolutely. That's a very good point.
Yeah.
It's actually kind of strange to see. Yeah, and like you said, they look puffy. I mean,
yeah.
really.
Yeah.
And so, no, I totally agree. And I can get behind that. And I would also say that the speed with which I reverse somebody is sort of also determined by how well I think they're handling everything mentally. Mm-hmm. You know, if somebody just seems like they've had enough, then, you know, in that situation, I will definitely increase a little bit more. I'll include some higher carb, some very high carb days to sort of give them a little bit of a release. Yeah. You know, it's natural to want to feel hungry. I mean, to feel full again after being hungry for so long.
Right. Yeah.
So no, I can totally get behind that. You know, like I said, I changed my viewpoint on that because I did used to be that guy that was upping it by 10 and 15 grams week after week. You know, and obviously I slow it down once I'm deep in the heart of somebody's off season.
Right.
But you know, in those early weeks, it was just too tough for people to hang on. And you know, now I kind of looked at that, especially after that Chris Foss study. I kind of looked at people, and I was never this bad, but I see some people brag about it online. They're like, "Oh, 12 weeks post show, and I'm up 3 pounds."
Yeah, I see that
like
still all the time.
And I'm like, "There's no way you feel good right now."
Yeah, that's crazy, yeah. I mean, I'm not going to judge anyone for the approach that they want to take, but I just think that at some point you're gonna break the diet unless you're actually a machine.
You have
unless you
your
don't
seasons are within like 3 months of each other. Like I
yeah,
don't know. Like
then there are
6
special
months
case
even.
scenarios. But if
But,
you're
like,
looking at a year or longer
Or
extended off season,
then you're just gonna eventually you can reverse diet for so long, and then eventually you're just gonna break, and then you're just gonna binge, and then you're just gonna get to the set point anyway.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes too where people they binge on their diet and then maybe a couple times and they don't like the way they look, or you even said some people get and then they try to go back to losing again. I'm like, no, that's like the worst thing you can do.
You missed that boat now. Yeah,
you
scrambling.
Yeah.
Cool. Well,
all right, Cliff.
Lots of good info.
I think that our listeners are really going to like this episode. We touched on so much cool stuff.
Oh, I appreciate you guys having me on. I really enjoyed it. Some of the best questions I've ever gotten, actually. I really appreciate it.
Cool.
Thanks again for having me on.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to it for a while, and we've actually been on a hiatus with this podcast, so I think we brought it back with authority.
With a bang.
Yeah.
Awesome. And I know you're getting ready for a show coming up, right?
Yeah, I'm going to debut in the professional ranks in Edmonton in 13 weeks. So
nice. So good luck with that. And
Thanks, Eric Helms is his coach, so we're really excited to see what Eric does with his prep.
Yeah, I it's kind of funny because I know all the 3DMJ guys. I've talked to Berto quite a bit and Jeff quite a bit. I've never actually talked to Eric, but I definitely know he's a good coach and I respect his work a lot.
Yeah. All right, Cliff. Well, thank you once again for coming on the show and sharing all your insight. And yeah, maybe we'll do this again sometime.
Awesome. I appreciate it. Thank you.
All right, man. Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.